What won, by the way, guys? Or are we playing more Warframe?
React to horror videos 1.
I did not have that one as a vote! Don't you try to gaslight me! Wait, what won, though? What won, guys? You guys aren't telling me. Y'all not like what won? You need to vote if you want your particular thing to win.
I already said chat and chill.
Chat and chill won? Do we want Helldivers or do we want chat and chill is the question. Wasn't that the question we were gonna ask next?
Yup, so the next poll can be chat and chill, dragon divers or scared dragon reacts.
Fine, we'll include it. If it's just Lock-On, I'm gonna ignore it. Because I know Lock-On will spend like 200,000 points to get horror. Lock-On, are you seriously voting for horror reacts? Why are you like this? You know, I just realized I never equipped my cloak because I think I got the cloak after I made up this design.
A look that makes a statement. And that statement is... I fear no one.
Look at that. Let's chat for you, Benny. Chat loves the 50-50 the vote. Lock-On, is it just you voting for horror? Tell me right now. Oh, Benny, you traitor! God damn it. Wait, then who's voting for Helldivers? Is Helldivers the one that someone's using points on? Or are we actually getting 100% vote? Here. We'll do some horror reacts and then we'll do Helldivers. Does that work? It's a known joke, Benny. Everyone knows I don't like horror. That's why they torture me! All of you are messed up. Messed up, I say. Messed up. Alright, put your stupid horrors in the chat. God dang it, it's horror of Warhammer lore. Fine.
Is one often characterized by its endless war and ceaseless over-the-top action.
Any suggestions, or are we going with Isenbrach horror?
We're going with Isenbrach.
40k is a horror story. The Milky Way galaxy of the 41st millennium is a nightmare hellscape, the hunting grounds of the alien, the heretic, and the mutant. It is a realm where ancient horrors prowl the dark places between stars, and unspeakable evils worm their way into the minds and hearts of even the most faithful of the God Emperor's servants. Nowhere in the galaxy are such terrors more abundant than on the many backwater feudal worlds far removed from the Emperor's light, and seemingly forgotten by the Imperium of Man. Worlds that are far too often forced to face the terror of the grimdark future completely alone. As it happens, such a world is the setting for tonight's tale. The Isenbrach Horror was a short story written by Darius Hinks.
Wait, they have books? Should I add some of those books to my throne, guys? Do you guys want me to read some of those books?
In the Warhammer Horror
I'll read a book off stream. Heck yeah, I will.
It's got a very D&D vibe, so I'm sure Boka will love it.
The spine-chilling stories included in this anthology. So if
Should
you
I put
enjoyed
some
this
Warhammer
video,
books on my
I encourage
throne,
you to support the original
Did you guys
release.
want that?
A link to the book will be provided in the description of this video. The story begins as many tales of horror often do, on a dark and stormy night, as we follow a man named Sabinus, a freedom fighter who, along with the rest of his brotherhood, plots in secret to free their world from the tyrannical grip of a planetary governor that perverts the word of the Emperor for his own gain.
When we get to where we have an average of
strict dedication to secrecy,
100 subscribers a month,
has begun to strike. One
because
by
right now
one,
we average
their
around
members have been
50
picked
to
off,
70.
killed under mysterious
I'll start
circumstances.
doing a
It
read
is on
chat to
this
sleep
night
stream.
that our protagonist, as
to
well as his
subscribers.
trusted confidant, decide to meet in a
I'll
ruined
read
cathedral
subscribers
feared
to
haunted by the
sleep.
village locals. Although the pair believe the myths to be utter nonsense, they do not deny the usefulness
hour
of
and a
their
half
existence,
stream at night.
as they guarantee privacy for the delicate planning of regicide. As they say, however,
Deal?
all legends bear at least a kernel of truth, and it is here, in the crumbling ruins of the old Isenbrach Basilica,
Did you guys
that they
know
will
you
come
could
face
sub
to
for
face
free with
an
Prime?
ancient, predatory evil. So come with me,
I
my
always love
friends.
saying that.
Gather
It's
round
funny.
and listen well, as
Even
we
if it
face
doesn't
down
work,
the
it's
Isenbrach
hilarious to
horror
say.
and another spine-chilling entry in the GrimDark story hour. But first, a quick shout out to this.
Alright, before we fully start, let me go get some water. Because I am thirsty. And I drink all my water. Okay. Now I'm ready. Let go! To horror we go!
Video sponsor, Into the AM.
If you somehow haven't heard of them, Into the AM
Ay-ya-ya!
is one of the best graphic tees that you can get on the internet. I'm a huge fan of their shirts, as you can tell by the fact that I wear them in pretty much every video I make, regardless if they're sponsoring it or not. They're easily the comfiest
Not gonna
shirts
lie, that shirt right there.
I own.
Oh,
Back
that
into the
one's too.
bombastic side thigh while they were
And
aft.
they've got a little bit of extra length, which I'm a big fan of. Oh yeah, and they're shrink and fade resistant. The oldest Into the AM shirts I have are about 2 years old at this point, and it seems like no matter how many times I run them through the wash, they still fit great and look just as good as the day I bought them.
Like that
now,
one.
Personally, I've always loved their loud, colorful, classic designs like this one, but they've been making these really cool vintage tees recently that are really starting to grow on me. Plus, they've got awesome flannels, polos, hoodies, and
They got flannel! Chat, they have flannel.
a lot more.
He calls them flannel. I call them plaid. Plaid.
They really have something for everyone,
I like
no matter
plaid.
what your style. And listen,
Did you know,
I know
guys?
you guys have
Did
been
you know
hearing me
I like
talk about
plaid,
how
guys?
great these shirts are forever now. But if you're still on the fence, I've got some pretty big news. Right now, Into the AM is having a huge sale to celebrate the 4th of July.
I bet this
where
is
you
an
can
old
get
video.
30% off site-wide. And if that
Rip
wasn't
plaid
good
shirts.
enough, my viewers can use the link in the description of this video or code WesHammer at checkout to save an additional 10% off their entire order. But be quick, because this sale's only gonna run until July 8th. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. Now back to the GrimDark.
The wind howled through the gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers towards Sabin
Ooh, I love the imagery already. That's actually really good.
as the rain cascaded down in heavy sheets. The sound of his horse's hooves striking
Shut
the
up.
muddy path echoed
You
in
don't know me.
rhythmic thumps as he made his
You
way
know.
through the enveloping darkness. Despite the appalling travel conditions and severely limited visibility, the route Sabinus found himself on this night was one he could have made drunk and blindfolded, for it had been etched into his very soul after hundreds of crossings in his youth. Those days were long behind him, as he was past his prime, pushing 50 years Terran standard. And although in his age, certain things had become more of a struggle, even if he would never admit it out loud, these roads were ones that he would never forget, as it was along their path when he was a boy that he first heard the traveling missionaries preach the Imperial Creed. It was where he had learned the truth, that the God Emperor was more than just a face in a painting, more than just a name to chant at the winter festivals. He was real, and an inconceivable distance away, seated upon his golden throne, he watched over and protected the faithful. Sabinus was a pious man, and though recent tragedy weighed heavily on his soul, the memory of those sermons brought him at least a small amount of comfort as he made his way through the wind and rain. Eventually, he came to a crossroads, and many of the paths clearly having not been used in decades, as they were completely overgrown with weeds and nettles. Yet many more were well tended and bared the telltale signs of heavy traffic. He reined his horse down the most overgrown path, pushing the animal on through the thick undergrowth, despite his steed's insistent snorting complaints. After about 20 minutes, they reached a clearer stretch that led down into a bracken-crowded gully. He carved a path through the forest for nearly an hour until he finally glimpsed his destination, rising up ahead. Ruined walls and crumbling towers reached
So, did they say, like, what planet or something we're on?
up into the downpour.
Or,
a
like, we supposed
giant's
to know who
arms
this is and,
raised
like,
in
where we are?
silent prayer. The old
the
Isenbrach
water.
Basilica had been abandoned for many years and was a far cry from the center of spiritual
Okay.
enlightenment it had
Just
once
making
been.
sure.
Most didn't even know that it was out here, and those that did spoke of it only in the context of an absurd
Random feudal
local
world? Alright.
folktale. The Isenbrach horror, the villagers called it, a malevolent specter of pure evil, a being of sentient darkness that lurked within its
So, like, is this horror supposed to be one of the void creatures, or is it literally like they don't know kind of thing, where like that's how like scary it is because they don't know what it is?
hollowed halls, feeding on any foolish enough
He just calls
to
it a
encroach
ghost,
upon
so I
its
don't know.
domain uninvited. Although Sabinus knew such tales to be ludicrous superstition, he was grateful for the
Maybe
legend's
it's a chaos demon?
existence. The villagers were a superstitious lot. They would never dare venture too deep into the forest, let alone in the middle of the night, and certainly not during a storm such as this one. Because of this unique combination of traits, Isenbrach was the perfect meeting place for individuals
At
like
this point, it's
himself,
just an old
people
wives' tale.
weighed down by duty in a desire to expose the truth, whatever the cost. He made his way through the overgrown courtyard and eventually spotted Zurbaran's horse tethered to a crumbling wall out in the open. He muttered a curse to himself. Even if the likelihood that somebody would come all the way out here in the middle of the night was next to nothing, they could not afford to be lax in their tenets of secrecy. Certainly not after recent events. Their goals were too important to risk discovery, and if found out, they would certainly be executed for treason. He untethered the horse and led both animals into a crumbling, roofless chamber. There was an old fireplace that looked like a gaping mouth in the middle of the room's center. He imagined the priest that used to call this place home must have spent many a night just like this one, gathered around for warmth as they prayed for deliverance. It was then that he saw the man he was looking for, his friend and companion Zerberin,
Heresy.
emerging from a crumbling archway. He had a big smile.
Ooh. Is this like art from the book?
Plastered
Nice.
across his rain-soaked face, and his long black hair hung in thick clumps over his forehead.
Looks like they feeding you too well,
He said, embracing Sabinus. Despite the grim news that he had come to share with his friend, he couldn't help but smile back. He'd always found Zerberin's good humor infectious.
When you're as old as me, you take your pleasures where you can.
He was truly happy to see him, but Sabinus had never been skilled at hiding his thoughts. The grim circumstances for why he had called this meeting in the first place were written plainly across his face, something his old friend was far too intuitive to not pick up on.
I know you wouldn't drag me out here to reminisce. I think we might actually drown if we stand here much longer. There's a bit of roof left on one of the other chambers. Come, let's talk there.
They picked their way through the rubble to a dry spot under some rafters, shook their cloaks free of rain, and sat on the remains of a fallen column.
You tell me, what new heresy has the sovereign committed? More statues of his pretty face? More wealth stripped from the cathedra?
Sabinus struggled to meet his eye, staring at the cracked flagstones instead. He took out a hip flask, drank some of the contents, and handed it to Zerberon.
No, for once it's not the sovereign.
He shrugged.
Or perhaps it is, it's hard to say, really. Have you heard about Solomon?
Yeah. Ill for weeks, I hear.
Zerberon nodded sadly.
He's dead.
Zerberon's face stiffened.
Dead?
The illness was a story, propagated to keep his vassals from hysteria and stop his rivals seizing power. He was missing for a week, and then his horse returned. Deranged, covered in blood, carrying scraps of Solomon, pieces of his scalp.
Zerberon paled. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, and they sat there, listening to the rain drumming on the rafters.
He might not be dead,
he said quietly. Sabinus shook his head.
Now, I thought the same as you for a while, but then the weeks went by.
Zerberon stared at the floor.
And that's not all. Kasserin has vanished too.
Zerberon winced. Solomon and Kasserin were not simply their friends. They were fellow conspirators, members of their secret society that they had christened the Terran Brotherhood. They had all sworn a sacred oath.
Nah, that can't be a coincidence,
he said, his voice taut.
No, but this changes nothing. That's why I wanted you to hear it from me. You still gotta remain true to the...
It changes nothing. How can you say that? It changes everything. We've been discovered, Sabinus.
It changes nothing.
Sabinus struggled to keep his voice level.
We still can't let the sovereign stay on the throne. He's a tyrant and a heretic. We can't let him continue perverting the word of the God Emperor with his vanity and idolatry. We've seen the truth, Zerberon, and now we can't simply unsee it. The sovereign claims to be a man of faith, but it's a lie. You know it is. He corrupts the Emperor's word and uses the Imperial Creed to secure his grip on power. He doesn't believe, not as we do. He has to go.
Yeah, but what can we do?
Muttered Zerberon.
If the Brotherhood's been discovered, a sovereign won't stop at killing just the two of us. He'll want all our heads. He'll send his agents after us. He'll hunt us down.
If we've been discovered, it means someone betrayed us. Someone in the Brotherhood. It's the only explanation.
Zerberon looked appalled.
Are you accusing me?
No. I knew as soon as I saw your face that it couldn't be you.
Who then? Cimerus, Miana, Taurus? It'll be their death sentence too if the Sovereign has learned what we've discussed.
Unless one of them is working for the Sovereign.
No, I can't believe it. I won't. It can't be any of them.
Sabinus shook his head.
It has to be one of us. Think how careful we've been.
Boca, roll a
Makes
perception
no
check.
difference.
Why am I rolling perception
Zerberon's
check?
voice was cold and hard.
We failed. We can't fail. How could we ever pray to the God Emperor again if we left the Sovereign on his throne? Would be even...
So, is this like a general or like leader of their group? Who's kind of being heretical or something?
More heretical than the sovereign himself. Remember the words of the missionaries. It's our duty to cast out the heretic. We are bound by faith.
Zurbrun rose to his feet, gripping the handle of his sword. For a moment, Sabinus thought that he was about to draw the weapon.
No, if I'm getting
and threaten
attacked
him,
from behind, you can't
but he
backstab
turned
me.
to leave instead.
If he knows some names,
Powerful.
he knows all our names.
Sabinus grabbed his arm, about to continue the argument, when a rattling sound echoed through the ruins. They froze and stared at each other.
You were followed,
Whispered Sabinus.
Impossible. I was too careful. No one knows I'm here, even my servants.
The sound came again, like a sword rattling in its scabbard. They crept slowly across the ruins, moving away from the rafters and stepping back into the rain, drawing their swords and clutching them tightly. Sabinus thought about retrieving the pistol from one of his saddlebags, but quickly dismissed the idea. It would be useless in a heavy downpour like this, and if there really was someone out there, stepping out into the open would risk discovery. Zurbrun tapped Sabinus on the shoulder and motioned towards a mostly intact passageway that offered good cover. He nodded, and they headed in that direction, keeping their heads low. As they moved deeper inside of the ruins, there was still no cover from the rain, and its persistent fall made it impossible to light a torch. They fumbled their way through the darkness until they eventually came to a set of age-worn steps. They descended down into another room and found the culprit behind the noise. An old trapdoor
The sovereign
in
is
center
basically
of
the king of
room
this
had
world.
been loosened by the storm and was banging open and
These guys are
shut
trying to
like the
part of
gaping
resistance,
maw
trying to
of a
overthrow him.
primordial beast. Zurbrun let out a sigh of relief.
There's no one here.
As much as Sabinus wanted to take him at his word,
Basically,
he wasn't
Benny.
so
Basically.
sure. He
I'm
dropped
OP.
to one knee and inspected the opening. The yawning darkness beyond was profound, and he could make out nothing save for the first few steps leading underneath the basilica. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention, and an icy chill grip around his heart as he stared into the black void before him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and someone, or something, was waiting for him down below.
Look at the lock. It's been used recently. Someone is here.
Zurbrun knelt down beside him.
And the dust's been disturbed recently. And it's not just the rain. Look, footprints.
We should leave.
Muttered Sabinus, a feeling of dread settling over him. He had to look over his shoulder to reassure himself that there was no one behind him. Zurbrun shook his head.
This could be the traitor. Think of Solomon and Kasserin. We might have a chance to avenge him.
Anger flashed in his eyes.
Besides, if someone's seen us, we can't let him leave.
Sabinus shifted his view back to the trap door, and he felt a knot of fear welling up in the pit of his stomach. His thoughts turned to the ramblings of the innkeeper from the night before. His face had been flushed with ale and beaded with sweat as he whispered hysterically to a disinterested Sabinus about the Isenbrach horror. It's always hungry, he had said, always waiting. He shook his head and snapped out of it.
You're right,
he whispered, tightening his grip on his sword. He thought again to run back and grab the pistol from his saddlebag, but the fear of being exposed out in the open was more palpable than the aura of dread emanating from the trap door. Zurbrun whispered a curse and began climbing down the steps. Sabinus muttered a prayer to the Emperor and hurried in after him. As they descended, the faint moonlight gradually diminished until the darkness around them was completely suffocating. To make things worse, the air was heavy with the overwhelming stench of decay. But all things considered, the interior of the stairwell did at least provide a welcome reprieve from the rain. They had barely made it halfway down the steps when Sabinus felt something crunch under his foot. He bent down to pick it up and found what felt like a long piece of bone wrapped in shredded cloth. Thinking quickly, he emptied the contents of his hip flask onto it and created a makeshift torch. Now able to see, he looked around. For as decrepit as the basilica had become on its surface, the damage down here was far more minimal. On the walls, he could see peeling depictions of the God Emperor striding across the cosmos, bringing
I'm already feeling like at least one of them's gonna die to this like horror beast or whatever.
order and reason as his great crusade soared across the crumbling masonry. Zurbrun stopped and turned back to his friend, staring at the bone torch.
Where'd you find that?
He was holding his hand over his mouth and nose, trying to block out the smell.
It was lying on the step.
Sabinus looked around,
Can
raising
we
the
eat the
torch a
tail?
little higher,
No,
trying
he'll
to
die.
find a crypt or a sarcophagus in the
Even if you
wall of
could
the
cut through
stairwell
it, you would
that the
just
bone
die from
surely
the
must have
poison.
come from. But he didn't see any.
Nah,
And
it's not
toxicity.
old enough.
Said Zurbrun, his lip curling in distaste.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If there are priests buried here, their remains will be centuries old. But that bone still got dry blood on it. And clothes.
The innkeeper's face flashed through Sabinus's thoughts once again, spitting and cursing as he described the Isenbrach horror. Always hungry, always
Who knew
waiting,
playing League was bad?
Someone
Hey,
might have crept in here to die.
he said, not at all convinced by his own theory.
Injured, perhaps. There are bears in these woods.
The two men stood in silence, contemplating the situation they now found themselves in. Although it went unsaid, they imagined they were both sharing the same thought. They could turn back now and forget about this place.
Now, someone saw us,
whispered Zerberon, looking down into the darkness.
maybe even heard what we were saying.
Let's get to the bottom of the steps and see what we can find. But I'm not going to go scouring every crypt and cellar.
Zerberon looked as if he was about to argue, but instead nodded grimly, and they made their way down. Eventually, the stairs came to an end, and they stepped into a large circular room that was remarkably well preserved. Its walls were adorned with depictions of the God Emperor and 9 heavily armored champions in the midst of a great and terrible battle against an army of monsters that was attempting to lay siege to his palace. Sabinus was looking over his shoulder back at the stairwell, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched when he felt Zerberon grab him by the arm.
There, on the floor, leading to the archway. What is that?
He turned and looked where his friend was pointing. He could barely make out anything in the gloom, but he did see dark stains on the floor, leading into a doorway on the far side of the room.
Looks like blood. Perhaps it's from the person who was watching us.
Think about it. It could be anyone,
whispered Sabinus.
Why would it be someone who knows who we are? If someone's hiding out in the crypt, they could have many reasons for wanting to hide.
The two made their way forward, their boots tracking through the thick, tacky substance on the floor. They
shut up
entered the
about my
passageway,
wings.
And after
These
a
are
short
fake
distance,
wings, you little
spotted
butt.
what looked like a large pile of rags off in the distance. But as the two men stepped closer and it came more and more into view, to their horror, they realized that they had located the source of the smell. The shape was a withered, rotten corpse. The thing's skin was as white as bleached bone, but it was no skeleton. Its abdomen was swollen with rot. Its arm was outstretched, frozen by rigor mortis, as if the victim had died in terror, fighting off an unseen attacker.
Throne of terror,
gasped Sabinus, turning away and covering his mouth, battling the urge.
So what does this monster do? Suck the life force out of them? Or scare them to death?
To vomit.
So pale,
muttered Zerberon.
like marble.
Sabinus shook his head.
What are we doing down here? We should
Wait, said Zerberon, grabbing his shoulder.
Look at the cloak.
Sabinus forced himself to turn back and look at the body, a horrible sense of familiarity slowly dawning on him. Though it was tattered and stained in dry blood, the symbol on the cloak was unmistakable, a family crest, one the pair both recognized as belonging to a fellow conspirator, a member of their brotherhood.
Taurus?
It is, whispered Zerberon, creeping closer and staring at the body's sagging, colorless face.
It is him. How can he be here?
It was just then that their investigation was suddenly interrupted by a loud bang as the door to the passageway behind them slammed shut. They jumped in shock and raised their swords. The impact was so strong that it caused a wave of dank air to rush through the chamber, almost entirely extinguishing their torch.
Dink,
Sabinus
dink,
breathed
dink,
desperately
dink.
on the flickering embers, trying to keep the fire alive. But it was no use. The miserable...
Wait, so were they tricked into coming down here? Do they know, does, I'm guessing, the king or something know about the evil ghost or whatever?
flame that was left was only bright enough to illuminate the corpse at their feet.
Damn you!
Cried Zerberon, abandoning any attempt at secrecy as he hammered the door with his sword pommel.
Open this door!
Zerberon's voice was filled with panic, and Sabinus felt his heart race. He hurried to help, but saw that it was futile. The door was a solid stone slab without a handle. There was no getting through. Claustrophobia gripped them both. They were trapped, with no way out. Sabinus looked past the corpse into the darkness beyond. Another clattering sound echoed down the passageway towards them. Zerberon stopped pounding on the door and looked around, eyes straining.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, further down the passageway,
said Sabinus. He looked at the corpse again. Then he took a deep breath and nodded.
There could be another way out, and we have swords.
Zerberon gave him an incredulous look.
Yeah? Well, what else do you suggest? Wait here till we starve?
Zerberon closed his eyes, then he nodded and gestured for Sabinus to lead the way. As they journeyed deeper into the basilica's depths, the fetid smell of decay continued to grow stronger, despite the fact that they were moving away from Taurus's corpse. The faint buzzing of unseen flies in the darkness came to accompany the echoing reverberations of their footsteps. Sabinus felt like he was in a dream, a terrible claustrophobic nightmare. Any moment now, he would reawaken back in the safety of the inn he had stayed in the night before. But he knew that wasn't true. He knew there was no waking up from this, and if they were going to make it out alive, the two of them would need to keep their wits about. The light of their torch was so pathetic they could only see a few feet ahead. The paralyzing fear of what lurked unseen in the shadows, combined with the logical knowledge that moving too quickly risked accidentally extinguishing their only light source, kept the pair moving at a slow pace, an ominous feeling of dread building with every careful step. Not a word was spoken between the two, and their breathing came in quick gasps. Sabinus realized his hand was trembling, causing small embers to spill from the torch. They eventually came to the end of the passage and made their way into another large antechamber. At first, they thought they must have walked in a complete circle, but that couldn't be possible. They had moved in a straight line. They looked around in the darkness with their swords raised, ready for their unseen pursuer to make their move. But it never came. It was so dark they could have been surrounded by an entire army and they wouldn't have even known it, a feeling that did nothing to ease their growing paranoia. They crept forward towards the center of the room, and much like before, another large shape began to take form on the floor in front of them. It was another body, as
I'm guessing this is the next person's body. That's what it's looking like so far.
pale and sickly as the moon, as if the murderer had carefully drained it of every last drop of blood. But the similarities didn't end there. To their horror, they realized they recognized this victim as well.
It can't be. It's Cimarus.
Another one of their brothers lay dead at their feet. What had they both been doing here, and who or what had done this? As he pondered the details of the situation they now found themselves in, a horrible realization slowly dawned on Sabinus. There could only be one explanation.
It's a trap. Someone led us here.
They both turned to look at each other, but before either could open their mouth to speak, something massive stirred in the darkness and lurched forward into the torchlight to greet them. The thing was enormous, easily 10 feet in height, and towered over the pair. It had arms and legs like a man, but they were grotesquely elongated and wrought from powerful corded muscle. Its face was hideously deformed. It looked like it had been melted and then crushed. Its cheeks drooped in deep folds of pale, sickly skin, and its snout was fleshy and upturned. Its eyes were like beady black pearls of pure obsidian, and its mouth, which hung open unnaturally wide, was filled with wet, glistening teeth, each the size of a dagger and equally lethal. The thing's breath was hot and foul, every snorting exhalation bringing with it the scent of old blood and moldering flesh. In the dim light, Sabinus struggled to make out the details. It was as if this thing was so unnatural, such a mockery of the laws of nature, that his mind refused to comprehend all but its most prominent features. For to witness such a horror raw and unfiltered was to court irreparable madness. They were both frozen in fear, their swords hanging limply in the grips of arms that refused to move. The thing's head drifted slowly from side to side, as if calmly studying them. It raised its arms, revealing thin, leathery wings. Then, with a sickening, inhuman speed, its head shot forward, its massive jaws snapping with a violent, wet crunch around Zerberon's neck. Sabinus stared on in horror as his friend crumbled to the floor with the hideous thing hunched over him, eagerly sucking at his throat with revolting, breathy snorts. For a few terrible, agonizing moments, Zerberon was still alive, thrashing weakly against his attacker, his heels drumming against the floor. All he could do was stare into Sabinus's eyes as his life force drained away. The monster flexed, enveloping him in its huge leathery wings, breaking Sabinus's view as it fed. Sabinus slowly backed away, drunk on terror, and tripped over a loose flagstone. His sword and torch slipped from his grip, and it fizzled out as it hit the ground. plunging the chamber into darkness. Sabinus was no coward. He was a veteran of dozens of battles. But as he sat there in the dark, listening to the sounds of tearing meat and snapping bones, it was as if he was a terrified child once again. In a sudden moment of clarity, he snapped out of his trance, leapt to his feet, and sprinted back the way he had come. In his panic state, the logical thought of retrieving his downed weapon was drowned out by the most primitive part of his brain's command to run. The only thing he could think to do was to put as much distance between himself and that abomination as possible. He was running blind, and he had only made it a short distance before he came to a sudden jarring stop, white-hot pain erupting in his face. For a brief, terrible moment, he thought the creature had caught him. But he quickly realized that in his haste to get away, he had run headfirst into a wall. He recovered and placed his hand on the stone, continuing to move forward. He hadn't got a good look at the antechamber before everything went dark.
So, is this a bad horror or this is a hopeful horror? Knowing Warhammer, if this guy dies too, which I'd rather not. I feel like...
But he remembered that it was circular.
I don't know why, but I kind of like the
As long as he didn't take his
character.
hand off the stone wall, he would eventually find an opening, either the passageway they had entered from, or another that he could use to escape. The logical part of his mind knew that this was hopeless. Whatever that thing was, it was a perfectly honed killing machine, evolved to hunt in perfect darkness. It would catch him, and it would tear him to pieces. But that didn't matter. He was running on pure fear and adrenaline, and the desire to survive pushed him on. He ran as fast as he could, his heart thundering in his chest as he desperately searched for a way out. Suddenly, there was another explosion of pain, this time in his shins, and he felt his body tumbling forward. But something jagged and hard broke his fall. Although he couldn't see what he landed on, he knew he hadn't fallen completely
Bye,
prone.
Q. Have a good
And
time.
after feeling around with his hands, he realized
Miss
he
you,
had tripped
Q.
over the first few steps at the bottom of a stairwell. He could hear the terrible sounds of the beast feeding on his friend, but they were distant now, more muffled. A fleeting ember of hope ignited in his chest, and it
It's a
pushed him
feral
up the
tyrannid?
steps into another room. He could tell by the echo his
Maybe.
feet were making that this was another massive auditorium, maybe even the one they had first entered, but there was no way to know. He couldn't see his own hands in front of his face, let alone make out his surroundings. He repeated his strategy from before, fumbling through the dark with his arms outstretched until he found a wall he could use as a guide. After he found it, he ran along the room's perimeter. As he made his way, he could see the gloom ahead beginning to break, the chamber around him coming more and more into focus. There was moonlight here, spilling from some steps up above. He had found it, a way out of this nightmare. He dashed for the stairs, and he had almost made it, when the sound of movement behind him froze him in his tracks. The creature had caught up to him. He could hear its terrible, heavy breathing, the rustling of leathery wings, and the screeching sound of sharp talons dragging across old stone. He heard it enter the room, its grotesque pig-like nose huffing at the air, savoring the scent of its prey's fear. He sprinted up the steps, clinging to the hope that his horse was tethered near the trap door. If he could just make it that far, he could escape. As he ascended, he felt like he was swimming through an endless abyss or rising from a grave. With every step, he shrugged off more of the figurative and literal darkness, like earth and sod. He could hear the beast following behind him, picking up speed as it forced its huge body up the stairwell. With a final burst of adrenaline, he leapt out into the rain-drenched courtyard. He had done it. He had made it out, but the monster was right behind him. He could hear its ragged breathing and the tapping of those lethal claws on the old steps echoing from behind him. He frantically searched around, whipping back and forth in the rain, desperately trying to spot the horses. And at last, he saw them. Or at least, what was left of them. One of them had been completely ripped apart. Pieces of torn meat and severed limbs were scattered loosely amidst a growing pool of red blood that was rapidly being washed away by the rain. The other had simply been disemboweled, its innards hanging loosely like a nest of thick purple ropes. He howled in despair as he rushed over to them, grabbing the creature's reins and frantically tugging at them in deranged desperation, as if he could somehow wrench it back to life. That's when he heard
he's
that telltale
terrified.
scraping sound behind him and turned to see the monster, its unnatural silhouette framed by pale moonlight and the breaking rain. Its mouth was drenched in gore, and thick trails of Zuberon's flayed skin hung loosely from its jaws. Even now that it was out in the open, he found it difficult to make out its more grotesque features, as if it was a creature not made of tangible substance like flesh and bone, but something wrought from pure shadow, a sentient nightmare, a mocking parody of existence. There was nowhere to flee. He was backed into a corner with a wall on either side of him. He whispered a prayer to the God Emperor and backed away, stopping only when he felt the wall press against his back. As if in answer to his prayers, the mental image of his pistol in the saddlebag flashed in his mind. Without wasting a moment, he sprung into action, leaping back towards the horse's remains. He dropped to one knee and tried to grab for the gun as the creature stopped merely a foot away from him, staring down at its prey with expressionless eyes. Sabinus's trembling hands scrambled with the bag, desperately trying to unfasten the straps. He felt a flicker of hope as his fingers brushed against the steel. He fumbled with it, trying to load in a shot. He was so focused on the task at hand, he didn't see the creature slowly and calmly extend a single clawed hand. With a creaking of ancient bones, it flexed its talons. Everything stopped. The rain, the pounding in his chest. It was as if reality simply paused. He felt something enter his mind, something oily and inhuman, a titanic alien presence beyond anything the mortal mind was capable of fully processing. Without thinking, he raised the pistol and threw it out into the rain. And as he did, reality came crashing back in. The monster crouched down on all fours, its face inching ever closer, its rancid breath spilling out as hot vapor against his face. This was it. Despite everything, there was no way out. It wasn't just his imminent death that caused his heart to sink, but the knowledge that everything he and his brothers had worked for was for nothing. They had failed themselves, this world and the God Emperor. He knew he wouldn't be around to see it, but perhaps in one final act of defiance, he let his final thoughts focus on the hope that one of the few remaining members of the Terran Brotherhood would carry on with the mission and eventually see this world free of tyranny. He lay down on the cold, wet stones and curled into a ball, waiting for the pain to begin. But after several long, agonizing moments, it never came. He blinked and looked up at the creature. For a moment, it appeared as if it had simply frozen, every muscle in its body locked in time. But then it began to convulse, every part of its anatomy violently seizing. It was swaying and shivering, and its hideous wings were pounding out of sync with one another. But what was happening?
Maybe it doesn't like rain, and that's why it stayed under the ground?
Was it sick? Had a creature evolved to live in perpetual darkness been so disoriented by the moonlight? The reason didn't matter. This was his chance to escape. He stood, but before he could turn to run, he found himself watching in disbelief as the monster started to change. It was now
no.
shaking.
Is it the last person of his group? It's the last person of his
so
group, isn't
violently
it?
that its silhouette seemed to blur. Its form began to collapse in on itself, its skin shrinking and reforming, its muscles ripping and stitching back together, every bone throughout cracking and snapping before reforming. All thought of escape dissipated from his mind as he stared mesmerized by the transformation taking place in front of him. The monstrous wings shriveled and shrank, folding back down into the creature's back. Its crumpled, bestial face stretched, the skin smoothing out, and the black studs were replaced with clear human eyes. He couldn't look away. In the course of a single minute, the monster vanished and had been replaced with the naked form of a magnificent noble, a man with cool blue eyes and tightly cropped hair. To his absolute bewilderment, he found himself staring up into the face of the sovereign, Lord Marville, the planetary governor and king of this world.
What the heck? Hello?
He had
This
no
is
idea what
crazy.
was going on. He couldn't comprehend what he had just witnessed. He sat there, lost in utter confusion for several moments. But soon enough, visions began to manifest in his mind. At first they were a blur, like a half-remembered dream. Yet gradually, they came more and more into focus, until he saw himself following the sovereign's orders, serving with dull-witted obedience as one by one he led the conspirators to Isenbrach. He had betrayed those closest to him because it was the sovereign's will. He realized with shocking clarity that there really had been a traitor. It had been him. All this time, it had been him. Those who had sworn their life to his cause, he had brought them here to die. Lord Marvel showed no triumph as he looked down at Sabinus. There was no pleasure in those eyes, no hatred, no contempt, not even idle curiosity, just an utterly alien absence of emotion. He took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders, stretching out his new arms as if he had just awoken from a long sleep.
Miana next,
he said in a clear and precise tone, in words that seemed to echo as much as they did through the air as in Sabinus's mind. Then he turned to walk away, disappearing into the rain. Sabinus crumbled to the ground, shock and exhaustion robbing the strength from his legs. He slumped against the wall, unable to believe that he was still alive. Then, with a rush of panic, he felt his mind begin to cloud, and the memories of serving Marvel fading away as the Sovereign disappeared. He gasped as the full gravity of the situation hit him. He was the traitor. It was his fault. The members of his brotherhood, his friends, were being killed. He was the Sovereign's slave. He rummaged through the saddlebag and took out a hunting knife. He stared at the long blade, tears welling up in his eyes as he gritted his teeth in despair and utter helplessness. He had to stop himself. He had to end this. He would not continue to serve that creature. But as he looked at the knife, he realized he couldn't remember why he was in such a panicked state. His breathing calmed, and he returned to his senses. He cast the blade aside and stood up, attempting to get his bearings. He couldn't help but feel he had forgotten something very important. He staggered forward, leaving the ruins behind, and made his way
It's a
into
horror
the forest. His thoughts were a jumbled
memory
mess.
horror thing.
He knew there was something that he had lost, something that he was desperate to remember. He had to find something, but what was it? He knew that everything hinged on him finding it, if he could only remember what it was. An hour passed, and he made his way out of the forest and back to the crossroads from before. It was then that it came to him. He remembered what he had to find.
Miana,
He said, with a rush of relief. He had to find her. He had to warn her. She had to know that the conspiracy had been discovered. He looked back at the forest, remembering that this was the site of the Isenbrach Basilica. He smiled. This was the perfect place to meet her. He had loved this place since childhood, and there, in the heart of the forest, they would be safe.
Oh, that's messed up. That's terrifying. I would not. Oh, bleh. 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 You guys like fucked up things. That's what I keep saying. Chat's screwed up. Well, that's already obvious. Everyone they found down there is because of him.
I did things.
How's he stop? You did things? Oh no. What did you do? Did you do something spooky? Something spooky dookie? Oh hell no. Don't even request that one.